morning everyone, it's still just about morning I think. Welcome to this session where we're going to be talking about how we can support children with intellectual disabilities to move well and move more. I'm Lynn Boddy, I'm going to help facilitate this session, and without further ado I'm going to introduce to Dr. Sarah Taylor, who's the postdoctoral researcher who leads this research programme. She's going to go through some background on the programme and then we're going to do some activities for the rest of the session. So thanks very much for joining us. It's great to see you. I'm going to hand you over to Sarah.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, so maybe a bit of a change to what you've sort of experienced previously in the conference if you were here yesterday. But our focus in our research that we do is with children with intellectual disabilities, and it actually picks up on what Brett was talking about this morning with co-production. And I'll get into that into a bit, but basically we want to try and use this session as a bit of a co-production session. So Brett's session has actually led us into this really well. We're going to ask you what you think we should be doing to try and get children with intellectual disabilities to move more and move often. Move well and move often. If your background isn't with this population, don't worry, we're keen to sort of build up on your own experiences, whether it's with physical disabilities, whether it's with coaching, whether your background is in schools, whatever it is, we want to know what you think we should be doing, and it doesn't matter if, like I said, your experiences aren't specifically with this population. So I'll introduce the topic area, build up on kind of the importance of activity and motor competence in this population. I'll show you the current levels that the research indicates what these children are at, and the barriers that they have towards participation. And that's when we'll get into this idea sharing. Hopefully you'll find it useful to hear about some ideas that other people have and maybe use in your own practice, but like I said, it's definitely going to be useful for us in our research. So when we talk about intellectual disability, we are talking about a condition of incomplete development of the mind, characterised by an impairment of skills, normally manifested during the developmental period. And this contributes to the overall level of intelligence. Example syndromes that you'll probably be aware of, things like ADHD, autism, Down syndrome, they are the main sort of three areas that we work with in the research that we do. And I'm sure everyone in this room is well aware of the importance of physical activity and sport, but what we are trying to argue is that is of possibly greater importance for this population, because when we compare them to their typically developing peers, youth with intellectual disabilities have been shown to be less fit, they are more likely to be overweight and obese, they are nearly 3 times more likely to have clinical levels of anxiety, and also twice as likely to experience depression. But what we do know from the research is that physical activity can have a positive impact on this group, both physically and psychosocially. So although they have these factors going on in their life, we know that if we do improve physical activity levels, there can be some positive outcomes. In terms of what the data shows, it's quite obvious from if you have a look at the research that they are insufficiently active. So if we look at the 60-minute guidelines, some recent research has said that they are just achieving over half per day, so 33.5 minutes on average of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, which is, like I said, just over half of what they should be getting. The most recent research that we've done highlighted that it was a bit higher, so there are inconsistencies, but still it was only 49.5 minutes during weekdays, so still not meeting those 60-minute guidelines. And this reduced even further during weekend days, so it appears that school is quite significant for this population, and I'll pick up on that a bit later when we talk about barriers, so we can understand perhaps why their activity reduces during weekend days. But that's the picture so far. They are insufficiently active based on the guidelines. In terms of motor competence, fine and gross motor competency in children with intellectual disabilities is significantly below average, and this is particularly for locomotor skills, so things like running, galloping, anything getting from one point to another, they are particularly below average for that. And also upper limb control, so things to do with the ball, whether it's overhand throw, striking a ball, bouncing a ball, they appear to be weak at these as well. So this is what we're talking about when we say moving well. We want to try and improve these outcomes in this population. So barriers to participation, this is just some research that has looked at what parents say their children prevents their children from participating in activity. So picking up on that moving well, so that lack of coordination and balance actually means that it's a barrier towards participation for them. They're unable to keep up with other children, is what parents appear to be saying. Another sort of disability-related barrier, cognitive abilities, behavioural problems, physical characteristics, particularly for children with Down syndrome, also appear to be a barrier. Issues of safety and bullying. There's a quote there from a parent in a recent research study talking about being able to play outside and the safety issues that parents have if they were to play outside. One which has possibly been highlighted quite a lot over the past few days is that lack of inclusive opportunities for these children. Parents report they find it difficult to find somewhere where their child can go and be physically active and somewhere which meets their needs. And also communication skills. So these children in particular struggle with communication and expressing themselves, and this can act as a barrier when playing with other children. So all of this has led to our most recent research study called Movement Matters. So we know that our activity levels are low. We know that their most competence is also low. So we want to try and improve this in local children in the area. So our intervention is trying to improve these outcomes. It's a charity, it's funded by the Bailey Thomas Charitable Fund. And as I said, leading on from Brett's discussion this morning, it's a co-production idea. So we've got local stakeholders involved. This was our first workshop. Grace, I'm going to highlight Grace. Sorry, Grace. Grace is here, so Grace is one of our stakeholders. She'll be getting an idea of what we're doing in our next workshop today. But we had some teachers. We had an adult who was previously in the Special Olympics and her mum who came along. We had local coaches. We all came along and kind of tried to give us an idea of what barriers this population faced. That was the first focus of our workshop. And I'll move on to kind of get you involved in a mini workshop today. So that leads us on to our first task, which you should all have a big blank sheet on your table. And what I want you to think of is what current provision exists for children with intellectual disabilities to be active. What provision do you know of? This could be within physical education, sport, activity. It could be online provision. It could be nationally, locally, regionally. We're interested to know what you know is out there for this population. And like I said, if you don't know anything about this population, maybe write down any provision that you're aware of for physical disabilities that you think would be appropriate, or even mainstream children. We're interested to know what good provision is out there. And then the second part of that, what policies currently exist to help children with intellectual disabilities be more active. And again, that might be policy that's related to mainstream children or related to physical disabilities. We're just interested to know what is out there, and we want to pick your brains. So we'll give you 10 minutes. So firstly, provision, whether that's clubs, online provision, programmes, local services, that all help children with intellectual disabilities to be more physically active. And the second part is policy related. Are there any policies that we should be aware of for this population? Okay, I think we'll try and get some answers out for you now. Hopefully that was quite interesting for you. It seems as if there was a lot of good conversations going on between the groups. We'll just ask you to maybe share possibly the one provision and the one policy that was most dominant maybe from your group conversations, or the one that you found most interesting, one that maybe you haven't heard of. If one person from each group wants to nominate, we could start with that back table. Sorry to throw you under the bus. So one provision and one policy that was discussed from your table.
Okay, there is the written rule that if you write, you don't read out, so but it was very much a collaborative. So in terms of policies, there was a number that we mentioned, but the National Health Guidelines are an overarching policy in terms of physical activity. And provision, really, we didn't talk about what provision exists in terms of actual things. We talked about probably where the provision kind of sits. So we talked initially very much about the importance of friends and family in enabling people to take part in activity, and whether it's more important, probably is more important with this group and wider in terms of disabled people. So you know, the ability that often people can't access things unless they have support to get there, you know, parental or caring, carer, you know, backing and support.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next, Stephen.
So for provision, I don't know if you want to explain about the gateway clubs, but I found the gateway clubs quite interesting. Paul alluded to them sort of 10 years ago being opportunities. Was it hosted by major clubs?
So we just had, in Leeds, there was a specific group that was the Gateway Club that then provided physical activity but opportunities and social opportunities for people with learning disabilities at the time. And my question was that, because they've not been actively involved for the past 10 years or so, do they still exist?
Does anyone know the answer to that question? I've not heard of them myself.
I've not heard of them. I put my face in a lot of inclusive sport for the last 10 years. So
I think a lot of them are part of the Special Olympics groups now. Certainly within these are
Okay.
What role is the sporting partnership frameworks playing? Every county has a sporting partnership.
really good question.
Yeah, it's I agree.
So they provide-
We had this conversation in our first workshop actually, where we mentioned that one of the barriers that was mentioned by coaches who worked in our local region was that there's actually a lot going on, but people don't talk to each other. Like in Liverpool, we've got Liverpool City Council, we've got Sefton, we've got Wirral, and there's stuff going on, but Liverpool don't talk to Sefton, Sefton don't talk to Wirral, and it's politics was one thing that came up, wasn't it? The politics of the local sort of sport councils, which is fragmented. Good work, Grace. Thank you. Any policy that you mentioned?
the national curriculum, P
Yeah.
scale.
Oh yeah. I like the way you said it. So the national curriculum, I don't know, I grappled with the idea about with regards, because I think a lot of it is pan when a lot of policies are made, as opposed to with regards. So I really grappled with that. But national curriculum should actually address everyone's needs. But you've also got the P scales that are just below the national curriculum, which a lot of children who can't access the national curriculum follow. And I do believe that's under review.
Okay. Thank you. Next table at the back in the middle.
Well, I think I'm nominated. I'm from the Dutch Football Association. We just provided through our mainstream clubs, and we play integrated with intellectual and physically disability players, and that works because we look at the level of playing. So they play together, and it's in many clubs already existing. So we don't need much funding because everything is there. We just need some goals and ball and staff, of course. That's most important. And it's also important for us. We think it's a social inclusion as well. So being part of the county, being part of the community, part of the club.
So what we concluded was it was a much more integrated approach, because we could come up with lots of good examples, but as you said, it's all kind of, it's not joined up in any way.
Okay. Thank you. Next table.
I think I nominated myself by making it so that no one else on my table has written. But I'm too honest, I'm probably just going to repeat what the last two tables have just said. We started writing lots of examples down, and then we got into the crux of the conversation of how much of this is actually as specific as the question, how much of it is pan, how much of it is inclusive, how much of it is actually really relative to what we're having this conversation about today. So for instance, we wrote Project 21 was probably a very good example of social inclusion in sport with those with Down syndrome. But then the conversation sort of exploded when we got down to policy, and how policy is very broad, and actually thinking of really like very specific examples is quite difficult. For instance, we ended up talking about the school sport and a physical activity action plan, which is something I talk about all the time. Where in my brain is there something really specific to this? I couldn't think of anything.
No.
I've got the phone out here and just trying to find something, but you didn't give me enough time. So it's probably just to reiterate that sort of, where is the drawing up, where is the specificity, where is the sort of magnifying glass of what we're talking about today. I don't know.
It's really interesting.
I
Thank
don't
you.
know if I've just said what everyone thought.
Next table at the back.
On my table, we were fortunate to have some colleagues from the Netherlands, so part of our conversation was really to start off with just thinking about whether the provision was more separate or more inclusive and integrated. So we had that conversation. We've also thought about whether if there was separate provision, what kind of provision that might be. So we were thinking within the UK about examples like gateway clubs and the Special Olympics. Seems from the Netherlands, and please correct me colleagues if I'm wrong here, that there's a more kind of inclusive mainstream routing of people with intellectual disabilities into club context. We were also fortunate to have dance specialists on the table here, so you would give us quite a lot of kind of texture around different sorts of dance opportunities, and some of those I think were targeting specifically people with learning or intellectual disabilities. Should I say something?
Yeah, so there's examples of different companies that do work, but I think generally in dance it's a lot of working with young people, and then there's a mixture of sort of all disabilities together in the room, and then some people that just specialise or have certain groups. But yeah, there's definitely also a lot for children or with children with intellectual disabilities.
We didn't really get onto the policy bit, so but this has made me think actually. We can think about physical activity as formal activity, but like for many groups we need to think about physical activity as part of your life, so active travel, etc. So, you know, I'm not sure where that fits within the discussions that everybody was having as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
The dance thing is actually a really good example, isn't it? Because it kind of sits between sport sometimes and the arts. But, you know, in Buckinghamshire alone, there are 3 dance companies for people with learning needs, mainly focused on the adult side of things. I think you'll see that echoed. I know there's a local grant one, but they're getting their funding through the Arts Council.
Rather than
Yeah.
Really interesting, thank you. Next table at the front.
Provisionally had an organisation called Action for Children, which is a non-profit organisation which predominantly funds activities for vulnerable groups, one of those being disability. Where we're based in Essex, there's an organisation called Essex Short Breaks, where the parents are provided with an ID number, and you can go on that website, you can type in the ID number of your child, and that will come up with all the activities that are for child with disability or vulnerable children. And then for policies, again, we had, I think on the first table, they said about PE and school curriculum. That's far as we've got, really.
Thank you. Next table at the back.
We started a map, and we looked at what we do available nationally, regionally, or through local authorities, and what would be available in localities and neighbourhoods. So we immediately thought of Special Olympics, and we then started looking at NatSet, Penathlon, and quickly went to Google, just to understand what we had, and I think that made that poster realise a point for us, that although there may well be lots of provision out there that we're not majorly at our fingertips, even as activists and coaches and leaders of our sport. So regionally, we looked at someone that do Sport UK, in Scotland we've got local authorities who do Sport for All through active schools, so through education departments. And locally, we looked at some of the critical and high valued groups that are parent-led, and parent-led because their child has been put out of Special Olympics, NatSet, Penathlon, or whatever. So those are the really huge part of that network that we would describe as a supportive structure. Some of the policies we started with the Children's Act, we started with those major bits of legislation that should be empowering all of us to deliver better services and better support structures on the ground. And then we've some of those ASN for education, and then with the CV, same as you, GIRFET, every child matters, and really then trying to ensure that our conversations actually begin to have real synergy and real coherence across all of those bits and pieces. So GIRFET matters as much, every child matters as much to us here in terms in the sport world as it does to curriculum for excellence, which we highlighted in the first or second year. So that's where we can enjoy our conversation, but we ran out of time because you stopped us.
Thank you very much, it's really interesting. Last but not least.
So, widely reading, there wasn't a whole lot of kind of wider structure stuff. A lot of this writing is just my personal experience. Obviously, we have Fiona here who's focused from Special Olympics, so there's a large network through Special Olympics, 80 different sports, incredible. I can probably count 80 sports. But from my personal experience, we've recently had the gear change report that's come out from the government. Depending, I don't like them either, but they've done a good thing there in terms of promoting cycling more widely as a leisure and just physical activity rather than just British cycling sport. And under that and their legislation document, which is like Traffic Over 120, they've got a lot of input on inclusive cycling as part of a provision too. So they're insisting you, like Active Travel England will be insisting that new cycle lanes are appropriate sized for non-standard cycles, adapted cycles and things like that. So that's a policy that's good in principle, though my day job is yelling at people from DFT and TFL and all of these people who go, yeah, well, you've got to have some give and take in the design. No, you don't. It's legislation. And we're like, oh, stop the cars. Those poor cars. But also, therefore, you've got bikeability cycling sessions, which is a national provision of inclusive cycling. We discussed briefly the Parasport website and how skewed that is and how lacking information it is because it relies on individual clubs to inform it. And I don't know, maybe we just need door knocking to find out what those clubs are. There's cheerabilities teams. I can think of 10 off the top of my head in the UK who are specifically there for athletes with intellectual impairment, which is different from the athletes, or the wider kind of fully inclusive parents of living work that we do. Loads of inclusive dance sessions, like opportunities, and there's a Facebook group, like Inclusive Dance Network, where you can find your local inclusion group, and a lot of inclusive dance tends to lean towards ID rather than PD. And then the kind of wider special education schools network, and also the alternative provision options that when kids don't function well in school, councils are required to give them alternative provision education, and that's often kids with neurodiversity who are pushed out of the system rather than specific more recognised IDs, but I think we're probably carrying umbrellas, and so a lot of kids with neurodiversity get pushed into the alternative provision sector, and there's a lot of learning through sport, learning through physical activity, move for physics, sort of stuff out there.
That's great, thanks everyone, that was really interesting to kind of hear overlaps and also kind of differences between the groups. This next and final task, we weren't expecting as many of you that have turned up, so we ran out of sheets, but we'll hand out some blank bigger sheets as well, so you can work as a group, or if you have got a sheet in front of you, you can work individually. The star is the best example, so maybe thinking about conversations that have been had, listening to other groups, what is the best example you think should be done for this group that is currently happening? And then the next bit after the star is your wish, so your time to get creative. If money was no object, if you could do whatever you wanted to do with this group, what would you implement? What would your programme, your provision, what would it be? You can be as creative as you want to be with that one. So your best example is your star, and your wish is whatever you would do if money was no object with this population. And we're focusing on children aged 8 to 10. That is our target population, but if you want to focus on teenagers or maybe adults, that's absolutely fine. Like I said, we're happy to build on your own experiences and groups that you normally work with. Okay, sorry to stop your conversations again. If you haven't, just jot down maybe what you talk about before you forget. I'm going to focus on the wish. I think the more interesting bit. Want to see what you've come up with, what you've created. I'll just give people a couple of minutes to jot down any ideas that they might have. If all teachers and all coaches just have that knowledge to begin with, we wouldn't have this constant battle of is this accessible, is it inclusive, is it not? So education focus. So yeah, so essentially to have it compulsory in the education country, some forces do a lot of. Any overlaps with education? Anyone else?
I think we kind of said the same, because you think the primary school teachers, they have a week just to run a training on PA, how to calculate data, and the same when you're doing your secondary teaching training, just having that kind of education, teacher education, for key teacher education, to help, understand and improve physical literacy at the primary school phase, and also the knock-on effect of that is to hopefully have positive experiences in PE activities, or ingrain that physical activity philosophy in their lifestyle way of life.
Any other overlaps with education?
We had providing education for parents, because a lot of people don't know necessarily how to find where the local club is or what provision is available. So assisting parents in being able to understand how to find the provision may then help increase uptake and such.
So the problem is the lack of provision is actually bad, isn't it?
No. Yeah, it's not black and white.
There's still out there, but
there's some stuff out there and people can't find it, so that stuff doesn't get used, and so therefore falls into the bin, and round and round it goes.
Can I ask a question on that one? Do you think that education for parents is needed about how to support their child just to be active in and around discretionary all forms of activity?
Ian was really pushing for that.
And I think that is something that we talked about, that, one piece is about supporting parents to know what's available, how to access it, but the other part is how they can help their child's readiness to engage with those activities, and just building those habits from early on, as would be the case with other children.
Yeah, I guess my concern, and this is just a concern in general, is that we're kind of focusing on clubs and provision, and there's activity from the moment you wake up that could be capitalised, be active from the get-go, but it's knowing how to do that and having the knowledge and confidence to instill that and to try and develop that environment.
Well, it's kind of one of the most important jobs in the world is having children picking up. No one is trained in that.
Yeah.
If you want to do a bit of coaching, you pay some money, you go on a course. You don't get taught how to be a parent, and you don't get taught particularly how to be a parent of someone with an impairment.
Yeah.
So it's kind of part of a bigger thing.
Thank you.
We touched briefly on this the values of good quality education, healthcare parenting. We talked a lot about co-production. At the child has an education, healthcare parenting, hoping that's co-produced, it's of high quality. Ensure that movement and activity is actually within that, it's of a high quality within a school setting. So I think once we start to kind of write plans and use plans in a way that puts physical activity level that it should be, then I
Any overlaps anywhere else that you think I can? Sorry, I was just gonna.
So this sounds quite weird, but from my experience, when I was a disabled person in mainstream school, the school was very intrusive because I made them. I was like, I'm gonna do PE, and if you don't like it, I'm just gonna do it anyway. Sometimes you have to put yourself in there for people to actually see what you can do, and I think there's been a lot of like apprehension with teachers that they can't cater to disabled people in their sessions, and there's a kind of probably a need to educate teachers in the training process so to not feel quite scared to include people. But yeah, like as a kid, I loved it. I loved PE.
I think sometimes scared to include. I think sometimes people are scared to ask as well, and like actually ask you, what can you do, what can't you do, what you're comfortable with, what do you want to be pushed on, rather than just assuming that it is how it is. Is that collaborative kind of process you talk about in another workshop?
Yeah.
Can I just give a lived experience? So, my son's high functioning autism. He's got pathological defiance disorder, which basically means he's like Kevin and Perry 24/7, right? But he has to have things black and white. So he was in mainstream school, so I'm just going to wrap a few things I've heard up. I've had to battle every day to get his EHPC filled in. He's not been in school since September because they can't sort his transport access in because nobody wants to fill the right paperwork. The school can't wait to push him off to another school. We found the right provision for him when he was year 9, but we've been battling since year 6. Because he's now year 9 and the paperwork took so long, nobody wants to take a year 10. So he's now between schools. So all the paperwork looks fantastic. You have to have somebody, so in his former life I was an assistant head teacher. I represented, CNDS was useless. I represented him in the case with 13 professionals, and I sat there and just went, they went, you've got 20 minutes, put your case forward. I went, I'm not doing that. You tell me what you need to meet my needs, because I failed my son. And I asked them to ask me the question. I've got quite a bit of experience in that education term, I found it very hard. So it's nice to say parents need more skills and more support, but I tell you what, the system does not work for most parents and they give up.
I mean, I remember my mum having to fight for me, to be fair, like when I was younger. Like, I mean, I remember going, you know, like say, you know, she talked to her son, like, you know, like, you'd say, you know, you should go to a mainstream school. My mum went, no, actually, she needs to go to this school. Like, so there is a lot of criticism about parents out there, because parents are the ones who shape us at the end of the day. Like, you know, they have actually, you know, they have had to fight for us. They have had to go through a lot more systems than we want to give them credit for, to be fair. Especially like the council, the government don't listen, so they think, oh yeah, okay, you know, this is all fine, but actually it needs a lot of attention and it needs more investment into it.
The other side I was going to make is because Callum is high functioning, so he played tennis, cricket, football, rugby, and to a reasonable level. But I've just told you that it's pathological avoidance disorder, which and it's black and white, which means he can't cope with rules, particularly if it doesn't go his way. So he ended up getting sent off, and I told these guys a situation where someone did a dirty tackle on one of his colleagues when they scored the try. So he pushed the kid. The coach entered the field and shoved him. Now he was 13, so everyone here goes, that's terrible. That coach got off because he was just in the emotions. Because Callum acts the way he does, most 13-year-olds would look at an adult who was quite big and go, too much. Callum cocked his fist and was going to go to blow. So he was quite happy to go, do you know what? You touch me, I'll have a go. So he had a 30-year-old going at the man. He got an 8-game ban at the league because you can't go doing that as a young person. Even though, his EHPT was presented, a statement from the multi-systemic therapy team was presented, his care worker presented, his school wrote a report that went, we don't care. COVID came, he never got to play, and he said, oh, I'm not bothered anymore.
I was going to say, what happened to the coach? Did the coach actually get
No, he got one. But I'm not saying it because it's poor old me and poor old Callum, but the system, particularly for intellectual disability, for kids who can go into mainstream, people don't recognise they've got them, they just see them as problem people. And that's the bit that gets missed. So Callum, I'll tell you, I spent 12 years at Rugby League as a talent league. So my job was to identify the best talent kids. He was probably in the top 5 kids I've ever seen in my life, and that includes Kevin Sinfield. He's also probably in the worst coach, but he's uncoachable. Totally uncoachable. So he had some potential. But the reality is, he couldn't fit in the system, and the system, because the match officials don't see it, the system don't see it, and so I totally get what you said today, and I've lived that experience. I wish it was easy with him. Don't trust me, you have to have a great day every day with Callum, otherwise it just explodes. But the reality is that some of the comments I made, I totally value what you're saying, and I've been sat there, I'll be honest with you, sitting there teaching, I was responsible for teaching and learning the skill. I thought AHPCs were fantastic until I had to go and fill one in and do it. So the reality is that the bits that everyone said today don't always connect up, and there's a lot of people who fall through the gaps, and Callum made a point, and he's autistic, so he went, if I was in a wheelchair, Dad, they'd treat me differently.
So what you're saying is there's a systemic problem, and actually that's reflected a little bit in the complete unjoined upness of everything we've discussed today. And the other area that it is that inclusion just doesn't work for a lot of kids that fall into this category, because you need very small groups, very well-trained people, and the right environment for it to happen.
And the process takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's what, he basically has fallen in the gap. The school have said it, and the Senko and everybody said it at two different reasons. That is, Callum fell through a gap because it took too long to get him identified, and then nobody really knows what to do with him. And when that's on your report, nobody knows what to do with him. That's not a great example of a 15, soon to be 60-year-old boy, is it?
So it's almost going back to the policy issues, isn't it, and really having to start addressing it somewhere that's very coordinating.
I think we're running over. It's time for lunch. You'll be glad to know. But if you could just leave everything that you've written on the tables for us, so we can have a look at kind of the ideas you came up with, the things, that'd be great. Thank you.